The imperial system of measurement, so like feet and yards and miles and that sort of stuff, is actually a good system. Here's my argument, is that the metric system is optimized for easy to do math, which is great. But the imperial system is optimized for human cognition, which is something that you do a lot more often. For example, without ever been taught this rule, you have always complied with this rule. If a stick is about a yard long, you'll call it a stick. If it's less than a yard long, you'll call it a short stick. If it's more than a yard long, you'll call it a really long stick. All people of all cultures will refer to things as handheld objects or hand tools if they're about a foot long. Most hammers are about a foot long, but whenever anyone picks this one up, they go, wow, that's a beefy hammer. It's because this one's 18 inches. Household objects, you'll call them a small object if it's smaller than a foot, but you'll just call it an object if it's about a yard. But once an object is well over 3 feet, it's long. A box that's 1 or 2 feet long, you call it a box. A box that's less than a foot long, you call it a little box. And if a box is well over 3 feet long, well, now that's just a big box. Okay, so the comments on that video are very interesting. I noticed that there was a lot of Americans saying, oh yeah, I never thought about it that way. And there was a lot of European people who said like, no, I don't like this. So I'm realizing that there's additional context I must provide our European friends on this one. So it is not the case that Americans are just like raised with the imperial system. We use both imperial and metric in the US, and we start learning both at the same time. Starting when you're 7, 8 years old or whatever, there is a meter ruler and a yardstick in every classroom. If I'm working on my car, all the bolts are in metric. All of our sports events are in metric. You do 100-meter dashes and 5K runs and all that. And yeah, we still use the imperial system, but we only use it for specific contexts. For example, when I was in high school, I was constantly having to swap back and forth to 2 because our math and science classes were all taught in metric, but woodshop class was all taught in the imperial system. I used to be in the Army, and when you're in the Army, if you're exercising, you go for a 2-mile run. But if you're at the rifle range, you fire at targets that are 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters out. So that's thing number 1 that I think I needed to fill the European folks in on. And then thing number 2 is that in the US, we kind of culturally think of the imperial system as the worst of the 2 systems because metric has all of this nice tidied math tricks to it, and the imperial system feels very like arbitrary and inconsistent. 12 inches make a foot. 3 feet make a yard. 5,280 feet make a mile. It sounds as ridiculous to us as it does to you. In that original video, I'm not saying the metric system is a bad system. That doesn't come up anywhere in there, and I feel like some people wanted me to be making that argument. That's not happening. But I am making the argument, and I'm going to double down on this, that the imperial system is not as arbitrary as most Americans, and I'm assuming most people in the world, feel like it is. You just have to think about it and use it in the way that it was intended, which is, like I said, for easy human cognition. For example, take this hammer. This hammer is this big, and it will always be this big. If I go to Canada or Australia or the United States, the hammer isn't growing and shrinking. It's that. And most objects that you interact with every day that you carry around in your hand are about this size or a little smaller because most people are about this big, therefore most hands are about this big. So here's another way of me making the same point from the original video. Let's pretend that measuring systems have never existed, and you and I are trying to make up the first measuring system right now. I am saying that in that scenario, I think it is much more likely for us to say, well, something like that, let's call that 1 of something, instead of taking something like this and saying something like that, let's call that 32 of something. Most large objects that you interact with throughout the day, a chair, an umbrella, a washing machine, those things are now 3 of something. All I'm pointing out is that it's very easy to understand why, when people were making up measuring systems, somebody would say, well, let's call that 1 of something, because most stuff that I deal with in a day is about that big. And then we'll call that 2 of something. And then we'll call that 3 of something. And if it's bigger than that, we'll worry about it when it comes up. That is very easy for me to understand how that happened. It's very comfortable for my cognition because you're centering the whole thing around distances and sizes and objects that you interact with on a regular basis, so they're very intuitive for you. And you make it all about 1, 2, 3. And humans love 1, 2, 3. There is a reason why wishes come in 3, and witches come in 3, and t-shirts come in small, medium, large, and riddles come in 3, yada, yada, yada. The fact that a meter is very close to a yard actually makes me feel more like this is the right way to think about it, right? Because the beauty of the metric system is you start off with this one arbitrary unit of distance that we're calling a meter. And then you do cool math tricks with that. You splice it up into 100 to make the measurement for small things. You multiply it by 1,000 to make the measurement for big things. But there's no reason that a meter needed to start off with being something this big. The metric system just as easily could work if a meter was the size of my thumb or the size of my house. And then we started doing tidy math to split my house up into 1,000 little micro units, or to multiply my thumb by 100 macro units. But no, when the metric system was standardized in the 1870s, you had to pick a random arbitrary distance to be that baseline unit, to be that meter. And people went with, meh, about that big. A distance close to a yard. Because that distance, that yard, that meter, that is something that's very comfortable for human cognition. Here's the only difference, is that the metric system takes that random arbitrary distance that is comfortable for human cognition because it's a size, a length, a distance that we are regularly interacting with, and splits it up into 100 chunks because that makes the math easy. But the imperial system starts off with a distance that's the same length and cuts it up into 1, 2, 3 because that makes my little primate monkey brain very happy. Again, just like in the original video, I do not have any criticism of the metric system. I think it's great. I use both. We use both in this country, but I am doubling down on this now too, is that I do believe that the imperial system gets a bad rap. Like, we treat it like it's totally random, like somebody just rolled dice and just said, like, that's going to be the rules. And I don't think it is, and I don't think it's an acculturation thing. I think whoever first came up with that system, who was not an American, right, but whoever first came up with that system, they actually did something a little bit more clever than we give them credit for. Yo, I do exactly the same thing. As soon as something gets like below an inch, I flip the ruler over and do everything in millimeters. I would much rather work in millimeters than work in 1/16ths of an inch. My dad yells at me though when I do it, because my dad says that when you start mixing measurement systems, that's how stuff gets off by that little whisker, that by the time you're done building the set of shelves or trying to align that sheet of plywood, you know, that little difference by the time you get to the end, it's like turned into like you're off by inches. But no, I do the exact same thing. If I have to deal with really little distances, I always go to the millimeters, because that's, the millimeters is way easier for me to think in than thinking 1/16ths and how many 5/8 is how many 1/16ths, whatever. Like, yep, you and I are on the same page on this. You know what's kind of cool? Responding to other people's comments actually helped me think of like easier ways of explaining this, because like it is kind of a not ambiguous, but amorphous thing that I'm trying to explain here. But one thing that I realized, the way that I can explain it is, close your eyes and picture 3 apples on a desk. Okay? Now close your eyes and picture 100 apples on a desk. If I were to be able to take a still frame photograph of the picture in your mind's eye, I would bet you that there were exactly 3 apples on your desk when you imagine the 3. But I would bet you that that 100 was just a pile of apples. Like, would you bet your life that in that image that you had in your mind's eye, there was exactly 100 apples? Like, 100 is of something is like a difficult number to like conceptualize. I think 10 of something is a tough number to conceptualize. 20 of something is a tough number to conceptualize. If there's a bunch of people in the room and I said, were there exactly 20 or were there 22 or 19? I think it would be hard to know. But if I said, were there exactly 3 people in that room, you would remember if there was exactly 3, right? So if we're looking at this arbitrary length, right, either a yard or a meter, call it whatever, and I say, now split it into 3, you and I are talking about the same thing, right? We're picturing the same thing in our mind's eye. But if I say, now split it into 100, you and I are probably picturing something different. So I'm not really, I'm from the U.S., we use both systems, we both use systems interchangeably, not really interchangeably, it's like in the U.S., like in specific places, you use only one system, right? When you're doing school, math, science type of stuff, sports stuff, you only use metric. When you're working on a car, you only really use metric. But when you're working on a house, right, or measuring furniture, we always do it in standard. And I think both systems are great, but I just think that the imperial system gets an undeserved bad rap. because people act like it's just like random. It's not random. It is arbitrary, but all measuring systems are arbitrary. Arbitrary and random are two different things. Random is just like I roll a dice and we just go with that. Arbitrary is we made some decisions and we go with that. But yeah, it's a weird thing to think about because it's like one of those things you never think to think about.